Company. Thank you for taking the time to join us today to discuss the challenges of operating across geographies with multiple complexities and the associated challenges that come with that and diminish your operational and financial performance, or may diminish your performance. Today's session is going to focus on WP&C's Global Market Complexity Index, or GMCI as we call it. That's a tool that we developed in partnership with the Wall Street Journal a few years ago and have updated on an annual basis. And the goal of it is to help global leaders understand and manage the complexity that exists in their business from a perspective of markets, operations, and regulations across multiple geographies and in countries where there are different complexity profiles across those areas. My name is Scott Stahlbaum. I'm a principal with Wilson Perumal & Company and one of the co-developers of the GMCI. And at the end of today's webinar, we're hoping that you all leave with a better idea of how complexity within and across countries you operate in impacts your ability to perform, new ways to think about your geographic expansion or potential expansion that moves beyond just looking at proximity, language, and market size, and overall just how to win in an increasingly complex global market. The webinar itself is scheduled for about 35 minutes with 15 minutes at the end available for a Q&A. And then to make sure that all of your questions can be addressed, we do have a chat function available through the webinar. So as you come up with those questions, please go ahead and type them in there, and then I will make sure that we get those queued up and we can address as many of those as we can at the end. At the conclusion of our webinar today, we will be sending out this recording and the slides that Stephen's going to walk through here in a little bit, along with the 2023 report, GMCI report. And I'll also tell you to keep your eye out in Q4 for the 2024 GMCI report, which is in process right now. So without further ado, let me hand it over to Stephen Wilson, co-founder and managing partner of Wilson Perumal & Company, who's going to lead our discussion.
Thanks, Scott. And I'd also like to welcome everyone to the webinar today, Winning in Complex Markets, where we'll get a chance to, discuss the complexity of operating international and multinational firms, and also share a bit about the GMCI that Scott was mentioning. Again, Stephen Wilson, managing partner, co-founder at WP&C. For those who don't know us, we are a strategy and operations consultancy. We were uniquely founded on the premise that companies are increasingly struggling with complexity in their own organizations, as well as the complexity in the markets in which they're competing. And to that end, we have written a couple of books on the topic. We put out Waging War Complexity Costs during the financial crisis. And then more recently, in response to customer client questions around how do we grow with scale, how do we grow our bottom line at the same rate as the top line, we did release Growth on the Age of Complexity. We do like to generate our IP in response to thoughtful client questions and things that kind of provoke us to take another look. And another good example actually is GMCI, which came out of discussions we had with the Wall Street Journal, and we'll get into that as a key focus of today. Just to give you a quick headline view of what GMCI is, it's the only worldwide index of market operational and regulatory complexity. We do it across 100 countries, again, across those three dimensions, leveraging data that's updated very frequently from institutions like World Bank and so on. And then this is where the magic really happens, where we take that data and we put it through our own clustering and machine learning algorithms to understand like for like. So for example, if you're operating in one country that has high regulatory, high operational complexity and low market, you have developed some skills and capabilities to operate well in that environment. And maybe there are other geographies that have a very similar profile where you could also be successful. So that's sort of the idea of that. We also have the 2023 report on the website for those who are interested, and again, there'll be a link in this presentation going out. So what are we going to talk about today? So we are going to talk about complexity. In terms of I'll go over a short primer on complexity, given we think it's a defining issue for organizations. Wherever you're operating, and then we are going to talk about the specific challenges, almost like the multiplier effect of managing across complex markets. We'll share more about the GMCI and insights it provides for multinationals, and we do want to wrap up with our view on some key levers, given the insights from GMCI on how to improve performance in complex markets. So let's dig in, and I do want to start with a bit of a primer on complexity. Just inside your home market, inside any organization, and it's our observation that organizations are being overwhelmed by complexity. As I mentioned, we were founded on the premise that this is a key issue for organizations from 15 years ago. And I'd say, things have not got any simpler since. You have increasing levels of digitization, digital transformations. You have new channels. You have, evolving work structures post-pandemic. So you have different levels of complexity. But maybe just to define it for a second, we like to think about complexity and define things at different levels of sophistication. And we would say the very simplest level, complexity is just the number of things in the business, number of products, number of technology platforms, number of suppliers, number of channels, etc. And you can probably see from just that list, there's not all complexity is bad. There's good and bad complexity. So the good complexity would be the variety in the products and services that customers truly value, or maybe it's the way that technology enables convenience for customers. But while there's good and bad, companies almost always have too much complexity. And the impact is, and also they don't necessarily recognize the impact of complexity because it's not usually that evident in standard costing or financial accounting. And so you start to see a increase in the sources of complexity, which leads to a non-linear increase in the impact of complexity. So on the slide here in the middle here is just a little graphic to illustrate this. You have items and links. 1 item, 0 links, 5 items, 10 links, 10, 45. By the time you get to 100 items, you're at about 5,000 links. And if you think about the items being like the sources of complexity and links being the costs or impacts, think about the number of emails or meetings or logistic routes or things that creep into SG&A. That's how we see this curve on the right-hand side. A foundational idea, for us, but we think for organizations around this complexity cost curve, where you have increasing levels of complexity driving significant cost impacts in an organization. And that has real impacts. So let me go to the next slide here. On profitability, it's the reason why you have significant profit concentration in most organizations once you correct for a lot of the cross-subsidizations in financial statements. In other words, 15 to 20% of your customers' products, services, other revenue-producing items drive frequently, 300% of profitability in the business. And you can see the little graphic on the top right here, but it was from a hedge fund-owned portfolio company. We did some work around customer profitability, and the bottom 10% of customers drove around $90 million of negative EBITDA impact. So that led to obviously some significant improvement opportunities, but it just shows this idea of profit concentration. Complexity also can slow down growth. And it's one of these these dynamics we call the growth paradox, that many of the actions companies take to drive growth often end up impeding their ability to grow. So for example, as companies do more things to chase revenue, then oftentimes they are driving operational effects which actually undermine key metrics, things like customer satisfaction or on-time delivery and so on, which are ultimately often the key precursors to growth. The graph on the left here is from Compass Group, a financial contract service company. and they'd expanded fairly aggressively to multiple geographies. I think around 80 countries in 2006. Saw both declines in both their margins and revenue, and then took us into significantly retrench before reversing those metrics. And finally, and a big issue in many multinationals is complexity can really slow down execution. Organizational complexity can lead to fragmentation, which can lead to impede decision making, a lot of back and forth. One of the examples here, we had a client that in the right spirit had devolved a lot of their decision making to the locality, and but what happened in the process, they become almost like a federation of fiefdoms, and so there was no scale of the mothership, and any decision that was strategic in nature, pricing, procurement, G&A, required 500 stakeholders to get it done. And so they're really frozen. In fact, the CFO said, we can't grow and we can't shrink. We're kind of stuck in place. So these are all the impacts you have from complexity in many organizations in the US. But then if you start to layer on top of that, the idea of typical multinational, international operations, you have almost like this multiplier effect. You have the in-country complexity. You start to operate outside your home market. You got to coordinate. Then you start to come face to face with very different levels of market, operational, regulatory complexity, very different from the US or from Europe, depending where your home base is. And that requires the development of very different competencies. So that's sort of the context. And then let me bring in the GMCI. So against that context, and again, we like to delve into understanding and doing research around this topic. We found a conversation with the Wall Street Journal around some topics relating to book growth and the age of complexity, and this is where really the genesis of this index began. Now, I'm hoping Dan Keeler, who was the partner economist of the journal. Dan, are you on the line?
I'm here, yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah, Dan, hey, as you're here, I don't think you're somewhere off the grid, but I appreciate you calling in. Could you maybe just share a little bit of the conversation and the kind of the ask you made of us?
Sure. Yeah, so thanks for having me on the call. Always a pleasure to see you and to join you talking about this subject. So yeah, it was around the time that you were launching a book about organizational complexity. I happened to meet you in the newsroom, and you explained some of the concepts to me that you were working on on a corporate level. And I was the frontier markets editor at the Wall Street Journal at the time. So my role was to cover and to really coordinate our coverage of small emerging markets. So this is places like Nigeria, Vietnam, Romania, Argentina, the kind of markets that are very interesting from an investment point of view, but really quite different. Each of them is very different. So even though you put them into this basket of frontier markets, you're dealing with a lot of different environments there, particularly on the sort of regulatory side, particularly on the ease of doing business side, and so on. And as you were talking about this concept of complexity, which I have to say struck me as being really, super simple in one way, but also very revolutionary in terms of how you think about organizations operate across different geographies. It struck me that this could work for fund managers in my space, which was the bulk of my readership was people trying to invest in frontier markets. And the conversation kind of steered towards, you've got Netflix up on the screen there. That was exactly where the kind of genesis of this idea came from, because I have a good friend who was somewhat fixated on the fact that Netflix just kept showing up good ideas for him for the next things he wanted to watch. And we kind of chewed around that idea, came up with the concept that, as you've written there, because you can succeed or because you operate in Indonesia, you might be successful operating in Ghana, Jamaica, and South Africa, which you wouldn't necessarily think of. Most people think of things in regional terms. So you think Indonesia, or I guess I should go to the Philippines, or I guess I should go to Singapore or Malaysia. But actually, you might find that they're very different in terms of the way you have to operate in those markets. And you might find it's actually easier for you to start operating in Jamaica, where the regulatory environment may be similar. So it really was kind of a conceptual discussion that we had. And from that, you guys, Stephen and team, went away and worked on some of the data that you have, came back to me with this idea that we could use these 3 different characteristics to assess complexity in markets, and basically ran a kind of a test of that. And I then shared that with some of the people that I worked with, or that I was working effectively for, the fund managers, the people that operate in those markets. And it was like a light bulb going off. They were like, this is actually really, really inspiring, where you can use this this data crunching system that you'd created to help understand if you were successful investing in Indonesia. Actually, it might make sense for you to look at South Africa as your next target for investment. So really, that's where it came from. It's been, very inspiring and very heartening to see that you've built it into this really quite coherent model. And I know that people that I talk with in my world very much appreciate and value the insights that come from it.
Hey, Dan, thank you for that. That was great context. And there's a plug there for Dan's newsletter, which is a very extensive view of frontier markets if anyone is working in that world. But let's get into the guts of GMCI. So that was with Dan's Vision Ask, and then we dug in and we used the ideas of market operational regulatory complexity, and then built down, from our perspective, what were some of the underlying drivers. And I'll give you an example here: regulatory complexity. We broke it into both the difficulty of compliance within a regulatory environment, the stability of that environment, and also the bias. To what degree is there a lot of corruption? Is there a lot of lobbyists? Is it very transactional? What are the kind of the biases inside that regulatory model? And then we sourced the data from this from institutions like World Bank, etc. Did some remove scale biases, etc., and then use again machine learning to group like for like. And this was actually a very fascinating process, because we were doing a blind study. We didn't know how the 100 countries would lay out across groups, how many groups there would be, and it was very interesting to see how this came out. But we did emerge with some groups based on, hey, let's group together, for example, the countries that are very, very low complexity across all 3, high across all 3, and all the configurations in between that, high market, low operational, low regulatory, and so on. So we emerged with the structure of the GMCI, 100 countries over these 8 groups. Now, this is actually from the 2023 version, but it's not too similar structure to the first year we did this. 8 groups, and we dug into to understand the nature of each of these groups. You can see we're surprised by some of the folks in Group 1, Australia, Austria, Hong Kong, Singapore. There's very high transactional, very industrialized countries. Groups 6, 7, 8, probably not too surprising as well. But again, the idea here is not necessarily a good and a bad, but basically it just requires different skill sets to operate in Group 3 than Group 6. And, those may have a experience curve or a cost, and so it's helpful to understand like for like. Maybe just to drill down a second here, Group 1 versus Group 4. Group 1 we call MVPs. Again, those kind of, industrialized countries, high transactional, very low levels of complexity, but at the same time, unless you're very, very efficient and able to deal in a very transactional environment, a difficult group to compete in. Group 4, low market complexity, high operational, high regulatory complexity, and often these seem to be some larger markets. In our view, we call it the walled gardens. Almost like if you get past the wall, there's maybe a interesting opportunity for organizations as long as you can navigate that operational and regulatory complexity. Also, we looked at some case studies, some applications, and I think the IKEA case study is very interesting. Now, they are obviously, we all know IKEA. They began in the 40s. They're now across 60 countries. They have around 600 stores. But and as a private company, they're taking their time in how they expand. But they did expand actually in a very in the same order as our groups. Group 1 and Group 2, Group 3, and for each group they they stay there for a while, learn some new capabilities before expanding into the higher complexity groups. So an interesting example. So what does the GMCA tell us, though? And there's a few foundational insights we want to point to. One is it brings new information. When looking at expansion, we talk to a lot of large multinationals, other consulting firms, and generally speaking, and I'm obviously simplifying here, but expansion decisions often relied on geographic proximity or language, or looking at the overall market size, which are all important factors, but less on the relative complexity, which often was the undoing and led to some kind of retrenchment in some situations. Also, that geographic proximity and common language do not correlate to common groups. So European countries span 4 different GMCI groups. And, I think for all of us on the phone who've worked across Europe, certainly very different working in the UK versus, Italy versus Spain. And so again, it may be obvious to say that in some ways, but again, we often operate based on the similarity around language and geographic proximity. No bad and good groups. There's probably bad and good groups for you or for a particular company, but certainly many large organizations operate very successfully groups 4, 5, 6, or 5, 6, 7, or 1, 2, 3. It's really around your ability to compete successfully. But this is important. If you operate across these many different groups, you will need to develop different sets of capabilities. It's almost like if you think about just you're operating, say, both a high volume, low variety product as well as a low volume, high variety products. Like different skills, different operating models, maybe different manufacturing processes are required. The same here. So if you're operating in a high transactional environment, low complexity, that takes some different skills than operating in ones that require maybe more, ability to navigate more regulatory complexity. And operate across many different groups, all things being equal, comes with a cost. And we'll get into the rationale here, but we've seen evidence to suggest that there's actually a hit to profitability the more groups you work across. Let me just do a bit of a deep dive into the 2023 report, and we'll just do a kind of Southeast Asia spotlight. And you'll see here, similar to Europe, the Southeast Asian 6 countries here we've highlighted. They span across 5 different groups. We also have introduced the idea of a complexity twin. So Indonesia's twin is Ghana. May not be an obvious expansion candidate if you're in Indonesia, but we have very, very similar complexity profile. Thailand, the complexity twin is Ecuador. In fact, we did a similar session about 2 months ago with this set of global CFOs, and the CFO of one particular global CPG company informed me that the Southeast Asia had been structured to include Australia, New Zealand, and many of the countries in here, and going forward, that being a restructuring to have Thailand, Malaysia, etc., managed in the same group as Latin America, or parts of Latin America. So very much in keeping with this idea. Also, there's a lot of diversity, a lot of variety in this group. So most complex Indonesia, high regulatory complexity, very expensive to import goods, very diverse market. Obviously Singapore, very low across all those different factors. And there is a sense of movement. Actually, going back to on Group 1 MVPs, the eagle-eyed may have spotted that the US was not in Group 1. It was in Group 1, but moved down to Group 2 in the last couple of years. Vietnam was in Group 5 and moved to Group 3 based on free trade agreements, inflation rates, and other factors. So that's a little bit of the Southeast Asia view. And also just to loop back on this idea that there's an additional cost to operate across many markets, I want to introduce this idea of a footprint complexity score. So we dug into this to understand if there's any correlation between the number of groups that you're operating across and the impacts and correlation to overall profitability. And there's more on this in a piece that we cite later. We did for MIT Sloan Review, but you can see this maybe on the right hand side. If you look at FedEx versus UPS or Unilever versus P&G, there's a general trend, and again, it's probably not foolproof, but a general trend between operating margin and footprint complexity score, which is a measure of the number of different groups you operate across and how far from the home market in terms of the kind of capabilities required. And that makes sense, right? If you think about, hey, I need to operate across many different types of environment, I'm going to need many different types of skill set, and they all have a cost. So there's less scale inside that business. So what do we do about this? Well, we want to point to a few different levers. The first one would be to assess your financial position. So the normal, typical financial assessment we do, the benchmarking we do, but also to bring in this kind of view of geographic strategy and understand your footprint complexity score. That's a starting point. The next obvious point was rethink your participation strategy, which would include things like, new market entry, or maybe you want to, exit certain countries, but also around how we deploy and participate across those different geographies. And finally, how to optimize the new operations, because you may or may not be able to exit your footprint, but there may be different ways you can organize, think about different operating models to fit with the different groups that you're competing within. So let's jump into the first one. So assess your position, and there's a lot on this slide, but let me just kind of give you the headline here. The headline here would be, we think, and this is my steer to the CFOs when we talked a couple months back. Clearly, you need to understand your financial position, benchmarking against your peers as a sense to try and drive some entitlement metrics, but also introduce this idea of geographic footprint strategy. Understand, where you're competing relative to your peers. Understand the impact that could have on profitability as a profit lever. And the inputs to that are on the bottom right. It may be hard to see this, but a P&G versus Unilever. They're both global organizations, but they have very different geographic strategies. You can see on Unilever have much more of a participation in groups 6, 7, 8, and they also have a slightly lower margin. And there are other factors going into this, but again, all things being equal, we think that's a key factor. Second lever, reconsider the participation strategy in the business, which means stepping back. And again, we do this, I think, we do like a thing about a factory footprint rationalization study we do in the US. Where do you want to have different facilities? The same idea. Where do you want to be playing? Where do you want to exit? Where do you want to, new market entry? But also, how do you participate? One of our clients is a cosmetics company grown through aggressive overseas expansion, and really by replicating the same portfolio of products from country to country. But we found, hey, one of the biggest drivers of financial performance was that these large portfolios going into small markets. And one of the things that we've seen is the bigger the market you're in, the more complexity and variety you can support in that market. And so really tailoring, narrowing what you take into a market can be a good lever for thinking through how to optimize across the participation strategy. Finally, optimize that regional operating model or global operating model. And let's say you're operating where you're operating. You're not going to go into a new market or leave the market you're in. Many organizations, kind of like the CPG company I cited earlier, tend to operate for a very regional basis, geographic proximity basis, but it may make sense to bifurcate or even trifurcate that operating model. Think about what makes sense based on the complexity of operating there. And that can be a key unlock for further performance improvements, such as thinking around where can we standardize processes? Where do we want to think about shared services around common process characteristics, or even where do we want to outsource the areas that we hard for us to compete on in some of these non-core markets. So those are some of the levers, and maybe it's kind of to kind of wrap up here, and then move into some questions. A few things. One is that complexity to us is a defining issue. We see it impacting organizations, across the United States, across Europe, with impacts on your costs, your ability to grow, your ability to execute quickly. And so that's a kind of a starting point. If you start to layer on top of that the complexity of working across complex markets, is really a multiplicative, a tenfold challenge, I would say. And that makes this kind of understanding and thinking really critical. GMCI fills a critical data gap. We haven't seen anything else out there that fills this gap. And again, we would never say this is this is the only diligence you should do going into a new market entry, for example. But it's a way of thinking that maybe should be continued as you think about your different expansion strategies. Again, it's not just a matter of looking at expansion or exits. Again, how we organize, how we think about operating model design is a key aspect of this. And just like it would be a mistake to think about one way of managing, a business with two very different characteristics. Again, back to this like high volume, low variety product set and a high variety, low volume product set. They may require very different ways of managing those businesses. And similarly, we think about managing different GMCI profiles. Finally, I would say managing complexity is a competitive advantage, and that could be around understanding the different sorts of complexity that are creeping into our business. From a management perspective, recognizing where the potential impacts will crop up. Understanding that there is profit concentration in the business, or how will it impact our growth, how to steal against that. And all of this, of course, leading into opportunities for performance improvement. We do have some additional resources here, also available on our website. I mentioned the MIT article. It was really looking at some of the economic implications of thinking through GMCI. We have if you want to go and take a stab at calculating your own footprint complexity score, we have some instruction there. Also articles around right-sizing your geographic footprint if you want to exit. So there's a lot of things to think about with that notion, and also getting very crisp around articulating a geographic strategy. Again, like many things, companies grow incrementally and without necessarily thinking through from a almost like blueprinting perspective. So it can be helpful to go back and look at your geographic strategy relative to your competitors. Certainly welcome any feedback and comments or outreach based on this. And then Scott, I think we have some time for questions.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. And thanks to everybody who submitted questions. I'm going to do my best to paraphrase and maybe combine a few of these. But something that seems to be on a couple folks' mind is just, as we talk about, or as you talked about, managing complexity within different countries where they currently have operations, right? And that's not something that it seems to be has been on people's minds in the past. So given kind of what the GMCI might bring to light about their current operations and where they're currently operating, what's the right way to get started in understanding your current position, and how should folks think about what to then go do, right? Like, what are the actions? It seems like, what are the actions that they can go take?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of like Dan was referring earlier. I think the first thing to do is just start to think through the business through this lens, through the GMCI lens. Acknowledge that operating in country A is slightly harder than operating country B, and raising the question around, well, where do we excel, where do we want to play, and then to the degree that we are in those markets, do we want to think about organizing differently around how we manage that? Do we want to start to group by complexity profile, GMCI profile, bifurcate our operating model, think about a different way of structuring our shared services, etc. But I think it's really beginning with just thinking through that lens, and maybe calculating your own GMCI score relative to your competitors. And again, we're all looking for margin opportunities, and that may be a different lever, a different opportunity for many organizations.
Thanks. And you mentioned footprint complexity score, and that's come up a couple times as well. It is an interesting way to look at companies like within your own industry, but that's based on where you operate, right? So I guess the kind of the synthesis of the questions are more around like that's not necessarily an easy thing to change, right? Like you've got assets, you've got people, you've got revenue tied to those markets. So contracting isn't necessarily a short-term or easy process to go through. So given that, and with the knowledge and says that, you know, footprint complexity score is very high, what can you do to react beyond just saying, hey, we're gonna leave countries X, Y, and Z?
Well, yeah, and that gets back to some of these internal levers, right? Again, I think it's how you operate, how you organize. Back to that CPG company that said, "Hey, we're going to rethink." Obviously, we have Southeast Asia and Latin America as two different regions, but actually, we want to start to group, almost regroup countries across those two regions in a way where we can build some scale in our processes and our management capabilities, versus just stay with a more regionally based operating model. And that's kind of one area I recommend.
Okay. And I think we've got time for a couple more here. So, there's one question at the beginning, right? You talked about complexity in general, right? And then we talked specifically about the complexity that comes with operating across different markets. So, how should folks think about how those two types of complexities interact with each other? And the fact that if you are operating across multiple geographies, there is language and market-specific products and processes that you may have to follow in addition to the complexity you talk about with the GMCI.
Yeah, and then anyone who's done work in Europe knows that issue around like packaging with different languages and regulatory licensing and so on. I think the way I think about it is the tighter your portfolio logic on the product side, the lower your internal bag complexity in your home market. That just helps you avoid further headaches as you start to expand overseas, where there may be some baked-in complexity. If you're going to go compete in Germany or France or Italy, you're going to have some intrinsic complexity layered in to access that market, or China. And so again, the more you can be tighter in your overall portfolio definitions, or your process, lack of duplicate processes and so on, the more that's going to put you in good stead before you take the next step and expand overseas.
And then just one last question that came in here is just, you had mentioned the World Bank and as a source of data, and there's someone pointed out that there are a lot of global country assessments that exist out there, and so how should we think about those? To talk about competitiveness or opportunity, how should we think about those in context of the GMCI, as complements or in contrast to one another?
Yeah, I mean, definitely complementary. I think in one sense, what we've done, think through Group 1 through Group 8 may be considered sort of a kind of ease of doing business ranking, but the fact that we're not ranking countries 1 through 100. We're actually grouping them together. So we're not trying to say, hey, one's this is the best country, the most simple country in the world, and he's the most complex. We're trying to help and give organizations a different path to understand like for like. So, hey, if you're anchored around some Group 4 countries, here's some other opportunities for you to think about as potential, further market opportunities.
All right. Well, thank you for all of that, Stephen. So just as we come to a close, I want to thank again everyone for their time today and their interest in this very fascinating topic. We will be, as I mentioned before, we will be sharing this recording, the slides that accompanied it, along with the 2023 GMCI report to everybody who's signed up and registered for the for the webinar today. And then again, we'll keep your eyes out. You will be seeing the 2024 report coming out before the end of the year. So thank you very much for everyone, and enjoy the rest of your afternoons.
Thank you, everyone.